Greetings in the name of Jesus Christ. Hi. Greetings in the name of Jesus Christ. My name is Miriam, and I'll be reading to you from the Colburn Bible, Book of Creation, chapter 3. It is known, and the story comes down from ancient times, that there was not one creation, but two, a creation and a recreation. It is a fact known to the wise that the earth was utterly destroyed once, then reborn on a second wheel of creation. And we can find that in Genesis. I'm not a teacher, but that is very obvious in Genesis 1 when it's describing the world, and there's Adam and Eve, and then all of a sudden Adam's alone and they have to create Eve from his rib. That's because Lilith, his original wife, flew away and would not return. And I don't know what happened with the angels coming down, being thrown out of heaven, falling to the earth. Everything was destroyed and then reborn on a second wheel of creation. So here we are. At the time of the great destruction of earth, God caused a dragon from out of heaven to come and encompass her about. Gee, that sounds a lot like Planet X, what's in our sky right now. The dragon was frightful to behold. It lashed its tail, it breathed out fire and hot coals, and a great catastrophe was inflicted upon mankind. The body of the dragon was wreathed in a cold, bright light, and beneath on the belly a ruddy-hued glow, while behind it trailed a flowing tail of smoke. It spewed out cinders and hot stones, and its breath was foul and stenchful, poisoning the nostrils of men. Its passage caused great thunderings and lightnings to rend the thick darkened sky, all heaven and earth being made hot. The seas were loosened from their cradles and rose up, pouring across the land. There was an awful shrilling trumpeting, which outpowered even the howling of the unleashed winds. Men, stricken with terror, went mad at the awful sight of the heavens. They were loosed from their senses and dashed about, crazed, not knowing what they did. The breath was sucked from their bodies. They were burnt with a strange ash. Then it passed, leaving earth enwrapped within a dark and glowering mantle, which was readily lit up inside. Gee, that sounds just like that planet we are all getting pictures of. The bowels of the earth were torn apart in great writhing upheavals, and a howling whirlwind and rent the mountains apart. The wrath of the sky monster was loosed in the heavens. It lashed about in a flaming fury, roaring like 1,000 thunders. It poured down fiery destruction, and amid a welter of thick black blood. So awesome was the fearfully aspected thing that the memory mercifully departed from man. His thoughts were smothered under a cloud of forgetfulness. The earth vomited forth great gusts of foul breath from awful mouths opening up in the midst of the land. The evil breath bit at the throat before it drove men mad and killed them. Those who did not die in this manner were smothered under a cloud of red dust and ashes, or were swallowed by the yawning mouths of earth, or crushed beneath crashing rocks. The first sky monster was joined by another, which swallowed the tail of the one going before. But the two could not be seen at once. Yes, this is what is in our sky right now. Thank you, Jesus, for revealing these scriptures to us. The sky monsters reigned and raged above the earth, doing battle to possess it. But the many-bladed sword of God cut them in pieces, and their falling bodies enlarged the land and the sea. In this manner, the first earth was destroyed, by calamity descending from out of the skies. The vaults of heaven had opened to bring forth monsters more fearsome than any that ever haunted the uneasy dreams of men. Men and their dwelling places were gone. Only sky boulders and red earth remained where once they were. But amidst all the desolation a few survived, for man is not easily destroyed. They crept out from caves and came down from the mountainsides. Their eyes were wild, their limbs trembled, their bodies shook, and their tongues lacked control. Their faces were twisted, and the skin hung loose on their bones. They were all maddened wild beasts driven into an enclosure before flames. Driven into an enclosure before flames. They knew no law, being deprived of all the wisdom they once had, and those who had guided them were gone. The earth, only true altar of God, had offered up a sacrifice of life and sorrow to atone for the sins of mankind. Man had not sinned in deed, but in the things he had failed to do. Man suffers not only for what he does, but for what he fails to do. Amen. He is not chastised for making mistakes, but for failing to recognize and rectify them. Amen. Then the great canopy of dust and cloud, which encompassed the earth, enshrouding it in heavy darkness, was pierced by a ruddy light, and the canopy swept down in great cloudburst and raging storm waters. Cool moon tears were shed for the distress of earth and the woes of men. When the light of the sun pierced the earth's shroud, bathing the land in its revitalizing glory, the earth again knew night and day, for there were now times of night and times of darkness. The smothering canopy rolled away. The vaults of heaven became visible to man. The foul air was purified. New air would clothe the reborn earth, shielding her from the dark hostile void of heaven. The rainstorms ceased to beat upon the faces of the land. Waters stilled their turmoil. Earthquakes no longer tore the earth open, nor was it burned and buried by hot rocks. The land masses were re-established in stability and solidity, standing firm in the midst of the surrounding waters. The oceans fell back to their assigned places, and the land stood steady upon its foundations. The sun shone upon land and sea, and life was renewed upon the face of the earth. Rain fell gently once more, and clouds of fleece floated across day skies. The waters were purified, sediments sank, and life increased in abundance. Life was renewed, but it was different. Man survived, but he was not the same. The sun was not as it had been. Amein had been taken away. Man stood in the midst of renewal and regeneration. He looked up into the heavens above in fear for the awful powers of destruction lurking there. Henceforth, the placid skies would hold a terrifying secret. Henceforth, the placid skies would hold a terrifying secret. Man found the new earth firm and the heavens fixed. He rejoiced, but also feared, for he lived in dread that the heavens would again bring forth the monsters and crash about him. When men came forth from their hiding places and refuges, their world their fathers had known was gone forever. The face of the land was changed, the earth was littered with rocks and stones which had fallen when the structure of heaven collapsed, when the dome collapsed. One generation groped in the desolation and gloom, and as the thick darkness was dispelled, its children believed they were witnessing a new creation. Time passed, memory dimmed, and the record of events was no longer clear. Generation followed generation, and as the ages unfolded, new tongues and new tales replaced the old. Chapter 4. The Affliction of God. This comes from the scroll of Kerubal Pachtherman, who wrote, "The forebears of all the nations of man were once one people, and they were the elect of God, who delivered all the earth over to them, all the people, the beasts of the field, the creatures of the wasteland, and the things that grow. They dwelt through long ages in lands of peace and plenty. There were some who struggled harder, were more disciplined, because their forefathers had crossed the great dark void. Their desires were turned Godward, and they were called the children of God. Their country was undulating and forested. It was fertile, having many rivers and marshes. There were great mountains to the east and to the west, and in the north was a vast stony plain. Then came the day when all things became still and apprehensive, for God caused a sign to appear in the heavens, so that men should know the earth would be afflicted. And the sign was a strange star. The star grew and waxed to a great brightness, and was awesome to behold. It put forth horns and sang, being unlike any other ever seen. So men, seeing it, said amongst themselves, "Surely this is God appearing in the heavens above us." The star was not God, though it was directed by His design, by God's design. But the people had not the wisdom to understand. Okay, I believe this is referring to Satan. Then God manifested Himself in the heavens. His voice was as the roll of thunders, and He was clothed with smoke and fire. He carried lightnings in His hand, and His breath, falling upon the earth, brought forth brimstone and embers. His eye was a black void, and His mouth an abyss, containing the winds of destruction. He encircled the whole of the heavens, bearing upon His back a black robe adorned with stars. Such was the likeness and manifestation of God in those days. Awesome was His countenance, terrible His voice of wrath. The sun and moon hid themselves in fear, and there was a heavy darkness over the face of the earth. God passed through the spaces of heaven, above with a mighty roar and a loud trumpeting, always with the trumpets. Thank you, Jesus. Then came the grim dead silence and black red red lit twilight of doom. Great fires and smoke rose up from the ground, and men gasped for air. The land was rent asunder and swept clean by a mighty deluge of waters. A hole opened up in the middle of the land. The waters entered, and it sank beneath the seas. The mountains of the east and west were split apart and stood up in the midst of the waters, which raged about, and the northland tilted and turned over on its side. Then again the tumult and clamor ceased, and all was silent. In the quiet stillness, madness broke out among men. Frenzy and shouting filled the air. They fell upon one another in senseless, wanton bloodshed. Neither did they spare woman or child, for they knew not what they did. They ran unseeing, dashing themselves to destruction. They fled to caves and were buried, and taking refuge in trees they were hung. There was rape, murder, and violence of every kind. The deluge of water swept back, and the land was purged clean. Rain beat down unceasingly, and there were great winds. The surging waters overwhelmed the land, and man, his flocks and his gardens and all his works ceased to exist. Some of the people were saved upon the mountainsides and upon the flotsam, but they were scattered far apart over the face of the earth. They fought for survival in the lands of uncouth people. Amid coldness they survived in caves and sheltered places. The land of the little people and the land of the giants, the land of the necklace ones and the land of marshes and mists, the lands of the east and west were all inundated. The mountain land and the lands of the south, where there is gold and great beasts, were not covered by the waters. Men were distracted, and in despair they rejected the unseen God behind all things for something which they had seen and known by its manifestation. Men were distracted, and in despair they rejected the unseen God behind all things for something which they had seen and known by its manifestation. They were less than children in those days, and could not know that God had afflicted the earth in understanding and not willfully, for the sake of man and the correction of his ways. The earth is not for the pleasure of man, but is a place of instruction for his soul. Amein. A man more readily feels the stirring of his spirit in the face of disaster than in the lap of luxury. How true is that? The tuition of the soul is a long and arduous course of instruction and training. God is good, and from good evil cannot come. He is perfect, and perfection cannot produce imperfection. Only the limited understanding of man sees imperfection in that which is perfect for its purpose. Amen. This grievous affliction of man was another of his great tests. He failed, and in so doing followed the paths of unnatural gods of his making, of his own making. Man makes gods by naming them, but where in this is the benefit to him? There is none. Evil comes into the midst of mankind, spawned by the fears and ignorance of men. An evil man becomes an evil spirit, and whatever evil there is on earth becomes either from the evil of spirits or from the evil of men. It is never from Yahuwah. Chapter 5. In the beginning. Now the children of Yahuwah were molded by the hand of Yahuwah, which is called Awen. Now, let's just stop there for just a second, because we say Amen, which obviously is a sun god. But I have always had a feeling that Awen was the feminine of that. Just in my spirit, even I wasn't Christian, I didn't really know Jesus at all at the time, but I used to say Amen and Awen, and I didn't know why. And now I understand. It must have been written somehow into my genetic memory. Let me start again. Now the children of God were molded by the hand of God, Yahuwah, which is called Awen, and it's manifested according to their desires. For all things that have life are molded by Awen. The fox, shivering in the cold lands, longs for warmth, and so its cubs have coats. The owl, clumsy in the dark, longs to see its prey more clearly, and in generations of longing the desire is granted. Awen makes everything what it is, for all things change under its law. And another thing I want to point out is in Yahuwah, what makes the oo sound is the double U. They used to actually pronounce it oo. So this would actually be pronounced, at least in Hebrew, Awun. And it almost sounds like it's very similar. Anyway. What I'm saying is that the original name of God, the W, is still there. Whether it's Yahuwah with the W, YHWH, or AWEN, it's always got the W, that breath sound, that ooh, with that sound, whoo, when you make a breath, the breath of life. Yahuwah, Awun. I don't know how to say it. This obviously is spelled Awin, but that's not pronounced with a W sound, it's a oo sound. All right. I mean, if you go way back, that's how it would be pronounced, Awun, or something like that. Which still sounds like a breath to me, or like the groan of a breath. Men, too, are molded by their desires. But unlike the beasts and birds, their yearnings are circumscribed by the laws of fate and destiny and the laws of sowing and reaping. These, the desires modified by the laws, are called enidvadu. Unlike the beasts and the birds, this in man is something relating to him rather than to his offspring, though they are not untouched by it. Destiny may be likened to a man who must travel to a distant city, whether or not he wishes to make the journey, the destination being his own destiny. He may choose whether to go by way of river or by way of plain, whether across mountains or through forest, on foot or horseback, slow or fast, or whatever befalls because of this decision is fate. If a tree falls on him because he chose the forest path, it was fated, for luck is an element of fate. Destiny leaves no choice. Fate gives limited choice, which may be good or bad, but it cannot be averted. What is fate, it must be, for at no point can there be any turning back. Amein. The circumstances in Nidavu of the traveler conform to the law of sowing and reaping. He may travel in comfort or pain, happily or sorrowfully, with strength or weakness, heavily burdened or lightly burdened, well prepared or ill prepared, while the destination is set according to the degrees of a former life. While the destination is set according to the degrees of a former life, then the circumstances of the journey should conform with the desire. Amen. For what use is it desiring a great destination when the law of sowing and reaping decrees that an intolerable burden must be carried on the way? Far better to have lesser aspirations. The decrees of fate are many, the decrees of destiny are few. Amen. When the earth was young and the race of man still as children, there were fertile green pastures in the land where all is now sand and barren wasteland. In the midst of it was a garden land which lay against the edge of the earth eastward towards the sun rising, and it was called Meruach, meaning the place of the garden on the plain. It lay at the foot of a mountain which was cleft at its rising, and out of it flowed the river of Tardana, which watered the plain. From the mountain on the other side ran the river Kal, which watered the plain through the land of Caladon. The river Nara flowed westward and then turned back to flow around the garden land. It was a fertile place, for out of the ground grew every kind of tree that was good for food, every tree that was pleasant to the sight, every herb that could be eaten, every herb that was flowered that was there. The tree of life, which was called Glazir, having leaves of gold and copper, was within the sacred enclosure, Sacred enclosure. There too was the great tree of wisdom, bearing the fruits of knowledge, granting the choice and ability to know the true from the false. Amen. It is the same tree which can be read as men read a book. There was also the tree of trespass, beneath which grew the lotus of rapture, and in the center was the place of power where God made his presence known. Time passed, and the children of God were grown strong and upright under the tempering hammer of God and earth, and the anvil of God became more kindly. All was pleasant, and food plentiful. But the path in such places, for it is against the nature of man to flourish in these circumstances. Earth is not for pleasurable dallying. It is a place of teaching, trial, and testing. Amen. The children of God were not yet the heirs of God, nor inheritors of godhood. But there was one among them who had almost completed the pilgrimage of Nidavu. He had unraveled the tangled skeins of fate, traversed the tumultuous seas of life to the many ports of destiny, and having paid the debts of sowing and reaping, was one triumphant over Nidavu. He was Fanvar, son of Alma and Ethem. He was wise and knew all things. He beheld mysteries and the secret things hidden from the eyes of other men. He saw sunrise and the sun setting in their splendor, but longed for things not realizable in the place where he lived. So because he walked with God, he was cut out from his kind and brought to Meruah, the garden place. Now that sounds like Enoch. He came to it across the mountains and wastelands, arriving after many days' journey. Weary and close to death because of the privations he suffered, he could just reach the refreshing waters, from which he drank deeply and filled with exhaustion. He slept. In his sleep he dreamed, and this was the manner of his dreaming. He saw before him a being of indescribable glory and majesty, who said, "I am the God above all, even above the God of your people. I am that which fulfills the aspirations of men, and I am that in which they are fulfilled. You, having traversed all the circles of Nidavu, and established your worthiness, are now made my governor on earth. You shall rule over all things here, guiding them in my ways, leading them ever upwards into glory. This will be your labor, and behold, here is your reward." A cloud mist seemed to gather about the glorious being, enfolding him so he was no longer visible. Then the mist gradually cleared, and the man saw another form emerging. It was that of a woman, but one such as Fanvar had never seen before, beautiful beyond his conception of beauty, with such perfection of form and grace that he was dumbfounded. Yet the vision was not substantial. She was a wraith, an eternal being. The man awoke and sought food from the fruits about him, and having refreshed himself, wandered about the garden. Wherever he went, he saw the wraith, but was unafraid because she smiled encouragingly, bringing comfort to his heart. He built himself a shelter and grew strong again, but always, wherever he went, the wraith was not too far distant. One day, near the edge of the garden, he fell asleep in the heat of the day and awoke to find himself surrounded by the sons of Bothos, not true men, but yoslings, kinsfolk to the beasts of the forests. They must be fairies. Before they could take his strength and wisdom, he loosed himself among them, slaying some in his rage and might before the rest ran away. And when it was done, he sat himself down beneath a great tree, for he was wounded and blood gushed out from his side and gathered thickly beside him. He became faint, falling into a deep sleep, and while he slept, a wondrous thing happened. The wraith came and lay beside him, taking blood from his wound upon herself, so it congealed about her. Thus the spirit being became clothed with flesh. Born of congealing blood and being sundered from his side, she rose a mortal woman. In his heart Fanvar was not at rest because of her likeness, but she was gentle, ministering to him with solicitude, and being skillful in the ways of healing, she made him whole. Therefore, when he had grown strong again, he made her queen of the garden land, and she was so called even by her fathers, who named her Gula, but Fanvar called her Arua, meaning helpmate. In our tongue she is called the Lady of Lanivid. Now God enlightened Fanvar concerning the woman, saying, "This woman was drawn from her compatible abode in a realm of beauty through the yearning aspirations of men. Her coming accomplishes something which would otherwise have taken countless generations. For earth is more fitting for men to learn manly things than for women to learn womanly ones. This woman is not as other women, being in no way like yourself. For every hair of her head is unlike that of a man. Every drop of blood and every particle of flesh is that of a woman, and quite unlike that of a man. Her thoughts and desires are different. She is neither coarse nor uncouth, being altogether of another, more refined realm. Her daughters will walk proudly, endowed with every womanly perfection and grace. Delicacy, modesty, and charm will be the lovely jewels, enhancing their womanliness. Henceforth man will be truly man, and woman will be truly woman, men being girded with manliness, and women clothed with womanliness. Yet they shall walk together hand in hand towards the ascending glory before them, each the helpmate and inspiration of the other. Amein. So Fanvar and Arua lived in contentment amid bounty and fruitfulness, with freedom from afflictions and sickness. They delighted in each other, and because of their differences, were drawn closer together. Arua brought one thing with her. When she crossed the misty frontier, the treasure of Lanivid, the jewel contained in the moon chalice, the stone of inspiration fashioned by the desires of men, never owned by any but the daughters of Arua. This, the Lengil, Arua gave to Fanvar as her dowry and her pledge of purity and exclusiveness. She followed the ways of the cradle land, not the ways of earth. Amen. Within the garden land was the sacred enclosure, the domain of Fanvar and Arua, forbidden to those of the children of God who had now come to this place, talking about the fallen ones. It contained the chalice of fulfillment, granting any who drank from it the realization of all things to which they aspired. None might drink from this save Fanvar and Arua. Also, there was the cauldron of immortality, containing an essence distilled from the fruits growing in the garden, and this guarded against mortal ills. Arua brought forth a son by Fanvar, and he was called Ruatoki, and a daughter who was called Armena. Each knew the mysteries of magic and the ways of the stars. In the fullness of time, Ruatoki married among the daughters of the sons of God, and had 2 sons, Enanari and Nenduka. It was Enanari who first taught the weaving of cloth from plants, and Nenduka was a mighty hunter. So here's where the angels start marrying men and teaching us their evil ways. Amena also married among the sons of God and brought forth a son who was called Belenki, and daughters called, that's funny that the name Enki is right in Belenki, and daughters called Ananua and Mameta. Ananua knew the making of pots and things of clay, Mameta the taming of beasts and birds. Ninduka had 2 sons, Namtara and Canaan. Namtara had 2 sons also, Ninduka and Dadam, before dying in the fullness of manhood. Belinki married Enedba and had a son called Enkiddua and another Enki, and a daughter called Estartha, meaning maid of the morning. And she became a great teacher among the children of God. This was the Astarta who became the first moon maiden, being later called the Lady of the Morning Star. Enkiddua had a daughter, and her name was Maiva. Outside the sacred enclosure, known as Gizar, but forming a gateway into it, was a circular structure of stones called Gilgal, and within this was a shrine, wherein was kept a sacred vessel called Gwynduiva. This was like a goblet and was made of rainbow and hued crystal set in gold with pearls. Above the cup appeared a shimmering moon-colored mist like a thin, cold flame. At certain times when the heavens were in proper position, the Gwynduiva was filled with moon dew and potions from the cauldron within the sacred enclosure, making a pale honey-colored liquor, and this the people drank from the goblet. However, there were different proportions in the vessel for those of the blood of Fanvar and the Ruah, and those who were the children of God, but not of their blood. It was the potion from the Gwynduiva which kept sickness and disease away from those who drank it. Dadam, the first father, who married Latha, and they had a son called Herthu. Dadam then married Mava, who had a daughter not by him, and this was Gweneva, the cuckoo child, fathered by Abrimelid of Gwarthan, son of Namtinigo, whom we call Luid, the dark father. So here we have a dark father that seduced somebody's wife, and they had a child, a daughter. And about the land of the children of God was the wasteland where Yoslings called the children of Zumat, which means they who inherit death, dwelt. Amongst these, Namtinigo, the wily hunter, was the most wise and cunning. He alone was unafraid of the children of God, and he alone dared enter the garden land. In the days when Astarta was teaching, Namtinigal often came to hear her words, and the children of God were not displeased, for teaching the wild men about them was a duty which they had been charged. Namtinigal, therefore, participated in their rites, but he could not partake of the elixir from the Gwynduiva, because this was forbidden. While it gave health and strength to the children of God, safeguarding them from the sicknesses of the Yoslings, if given to others, it caused a wasting away. It was also altogether forbidden for any of the children of God to mate with the Yoslings, for this was deemed to be the most unforgivable of sins. Now the wily one learned much from Astartha, and in the fullness of time he brought his own son to her, And he became as her son, living in her house and forsaking the ways of his people. Astarte called him Luid, the light bringer, for it was her intention that he should be taught the ways of those who walked in light, that he might in time enlighten his own people. Luid grew up tall and handsome. He was quick to learn and became wise. This is the story of Satan. He was also a man of the chase, strong and enduring, a hunter of renown. But there were times when the call of his people was strong. Then he would go out furtively into the night to indulge in their dark rituals. Thus he became knowledgeable in the ways of the flesh and in the carnal indulgence of the body. Okay, so this is the son of Satan. Dadam became a certain servant of the sacred enclosure, where the misty veil between the realms could be penetrated. For all those having the blood of Arua had twin sight, an ability to see wraiths and Sith folk, Ansys and spirit beings, all the things of the other world, not clearly, but as through a veil. Amein. Beside the place where Gisar was a pleasant parkland with trees of every kind and a stream, with trees of every kind and a stream, also thickets of flowering bushes and all manner of plants growing lushly. It was the custom of Meva to wander there in the sunshine, and Luid also went there, so it came about that they met among the trees. Meva knew the man, but had shunned him in the past. Now she saw he was handsome, possessed of many attractions, so her foot was stayed, and she did not run away. As the days passed, they dallied longer together, and Luid talked of things Meva had not heard before. She felt a stirring in her blood, but did not respond or heed his temptations, because of the things which were forbidden. So Luid went to the Moon Mother, wise woman of the Oslings, and telling her of his desires, beseeched her to help him. The Moon Mother gave him 2 apples containing a vile substance, which they had drawn through their stalks. This Luid gave to Meva, who then became helpless in his hands. He drugged her. They met again after this, for Meva became enamored towards Luid. But it happened that she became ill with a strange sickness and was afraid. Then Dadam became ill, and Luid also, and Luid said to the woman, "You must obtain the pure essences from within the sacred enclosure, and Satina, the Moon Mother, will prepare an elixir which will cure us." This he said because none of his kind had ever been able to obtain the sacred substances, though they had always coveted what had been denied them. So he figured he could use them to get them for himself. Now, because of her frailty, the woman was pliable in his hands, and Luid seized the opportunity. To achieve his ends, Luid gave Meva a portion of what had been prepared by the Moon Mother, and she administered this to Dadam and those with him by guile and deceit, so that they fell asleep. And while they slept, Meva stole from the sacred substances and took them to Luid, who gave them to Moon Mother, and she made a brew. Part of this was given to Meva, and the rest was drunk by the Oslings from their awful Enkidu during their night rites. When the morning came, they were all smitten with grievous pains, and before the sun set that day, all the Oslings were stricken with a sickness such as they had not known before. They drank death. Meva took what had been given to her, and finding Dadam laid low in his bed, gave him a draught from her vessel, though she had to use womanly wiles to get him to drink it. She drank the remainder, and they both slept. But when they awoke in the morning, both were suffering pains, and this was something they had not known before. Dadam said to the woman, "What have you done? For this, what has happened to us, cannot be unless the things which are forbidden have been done." And the woman replied, "Lord, I was tempted and I fell. I have done that which is forbidden and unforgivable." Dadam said, "I am bound by duty to do certain things." It's funny how Adam is in Dadam. "But first let us go into the Gizar, to the place where Beth Kelkrit called. I am bound by duty to do certain things, but first let us go into the Gizar, to the place called Beth Kelkris, where I will seek enlightenment." So they went there together and stood before the shrine beneath the tree of wisdom. There they were filled with an overflowing vision, seeing themselves as they were, and as they should have been, and they were ashamed. He, because he had not followed the proper path of a man, and she, because of her falsity. And there in the reflecting mist the contamination of the woman was revealed, and the man's heart shriveled within him like a flower licked by flame. And there they saw a great spirit being materializing in the reflecting mist. And he said to them, "Woe to you and your house, for the greatest of evils has befallen the race of the children of God. It is defiled. The heritage of Kadamhapa is lost. The fetid flow defiling the woman results from the incompatible intermingling. But it is not all, for sicknesses and diseases are also generating from the ferments of the impure implantation." And Dadam said, "The fault is with the woman, wherefore should I suffer?" And the spirit being replied, "Because you two are now as one. The cankerworms of disease and sickness strike both equally, but you shall not again defile this place. Henceforth the misty veil becomes an impenetrable barrier, severing our two realms from each other, so they can no longer be easily spanned. Between us there will now be no means of communication. Henceforth man and woman, fated to unite in love divine, shall be divided and set apart, though ever yearning reunion. They may cleave one to the other, seeking the unity which will rekindle the flame, but unless their efforts transcend the limitation of earthly things, they will be in vain. The spirit of man is now severed from the whole and cast again into unconsciousness, and it too shall long for reunion with the whole. The spark shall seek to return to the fire, for otherwise it becomes nothing. Amen. The web of fate is rewoven and the paths of destiny remade. The design of life is redrawn. Again the progression begins in ignorance, birth and death, pain and pleasure, joy and sorrow, success and failure, love and hate, peace and war, all the light and shade, the many hues making the splendidly intricate pattern of life on earth. This is a new beginning, but a beginning not in purity and unencumbered, but one already weighed with debts and burdens. The spirit being continued, "Enough wickedness has been wrought by your willfulness and disobedience, for the decrees forbidding certain things were for your own benefit. Immortality was not nearly within your reach, but had you achieved this, you would have brought an even more grievous evil upon yourselves and your inheritors, for freed from servitude to change, you and they would have been unable to progress." The children of God were driven out of the garden land by spirit beings, and then guardians were set at its gates so none could re-enter. Then it was withdrawn beyond the misty veil. The waters ceased to flow, and fertility departed. Only a wilderness remained. The children of God went to dwell in the land of Amein, which is beyond the mountains of Meshur by the sea of Delimuna. And from this time onward man fashioned his own spirit likeness. Some who were loathsome in aspect, even unto themselves, went apart and were mercifully veiled in dark depths. And they said amongst themselves, "Let us dwell here in the darkness, and prepare a place for others like ourselves, so that when they follow, they abide here and join us." They are preparing hell. Thus were the dark regions formed and inhabited by demons who are not but the hideously fashioned spirits of evil men. These things have been written into the record. In Saboit, they used to say this was the manner of man's making. They used to say this was the manner of man's making. God sent his creating craftsman spirit down to earth, and the reflection of the one was drawn into a spiritless body, and this became the heart of man. These are the words written by Thonis of Myra in Laodicea in his day. You ask me, what is man? And I answer, he is life becoming aware of itself. He is the intangible knowing, the tangible, spirit in matter, fire in water. When this first happened, none remembers, and only the old folk tales remain. There was the beginning, and then the garden, and it was in this garden man found himself. Before this he was not free, being one with everything about him. As he could not disobey, good and evil could not be. They were non-existent. Man became free through awareness of himself, and with this knowledge denied any kinship with the beast. As he was no longer in harmonious relationship with things of the earth, he became discontented, dissatisfied, and restless. He wanted to belong, but felt his place of belonging was not there. He had been reborn as a man-god, and therefore it is truly said that man was born of earth and spirit, under a tree, the symbol of life, and in a garden. There the eyes of man and woman were opened, and being above the beasts, they knew they were different and set apart from all else that breathed. They separated themselves, being now ashamed of their state and strangers to each other. The carnal satisfaction of lesser creatures now no longer sufficed. They had lost contact with the source of love, but though knowing something was lacking, knew not what. They had fallen into carnal knowledge which only man can know, for he feels the reproach of divinity. They were removed from the garden of content by an inhalation of the divine substance, and could not return because of the barrier between man and non-man. Kamelik has written, the entwined were cut apart, and since that day have never known content. They wander restlessly, ever seeking to unite again, and together find the jewel which is lost to earth forever. Lupisis has written, this first woman who came from the void is the eternally glorified goddess, the inspirer of hearts, the ideal of womanhood, honored by all men, the priestess at the shrines of delicacy and tenderness. She was the ideal woman who, because of man's nature, is always tempted by his twin shade, the beast in his form. If the beast triumphs and she falls, the ideal becomes enshrouded in a winding cloth of disillusionment, and something is lost to the heart of a man. These words also are there. They did not partake of wisdom, and fruit from the tree of knowledge is bitter. Men are denied their true birthright. The fall of man was a fall from a loving contact with God into material carnality. The soul that had shared the consciousness of God fell into unconsciousness by becoming ensnared in matter. The fall severed man from the source of his spiritual sustenance. Thereafter his efforts were to struggle back. In his blind groping for Yahuwah after the fall, he discovered demons and found it easier to worship them than to continue the search. No wonder they've kept this book from us. We need this book to understand what's happening right now. Yahuwah is always waiting. Man has only to look up. It is easier to go down the hill than to climb it. It is easier for man's spiritual beliefs to degenerate than to evolve. Who among men knows the truth and can write with certain knowledge? Would not this certainty be against the law? No man was there at the beginning to see and write, but of one thing alone we can be sure. The creating God knows how and why. And could the acts of one so great be without purpose? No, they could not. And we'll stop there and come back. Yahuwah bless you and keep you. Angels surround you and protect you. Amen. Amen.